Do you feel powerless, unseen, unheard, unvalued? Are you living an inauthentic life driven by the expectations and demands of others? A life dictated by your past, your wounds, your scars? Well, it's time to break free. Join Ellie Sheffy and her special guests as they guide you on a journey to leave the chains of your past behind and step into a life of your own design. Welcome to You Are Not Your Scars. Here is your host, Ellie.
Hello and welcome. Today's guest is a three-time serial entrepreneur, prominent keynote speaker, former Emmy Award-winning TV news anchor, mom, and best-selling author. Interviewed and quoted by major news outlets, including the New York Times, CNN, and others, she is an expert on unconscious bias, entrepreneurship, and utilizing business communication strategies that empower, affect meaningful change, and foster diversity and inclusion. She is actively and deeply immersed in mitigating unconscious bias using scientifically validated methodologies, exploring leading-edge technologies, and undertaking new business ventures. Her current business ventures include co-founding BiasSync, a science-based technology company designed to help organizations effectively assess and manage unconscious bias in the work environment. She is also the founder and CEO of Ruiz Strategies, a certified minority-owned and woman-owned consulting firm that develops and executes transformational communication strategies for Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and major professional services organizations around the world. Her deep entrepreneurial experience has been foundational in her quest to educate, inspire, and empower business owners. Committed to helping people and changing lives, her online mentoring program, Possibility Architect, serves female entrepreneurs determined to scale their businesses over $1 million in annual revenue with corporate and government clients. A dedicated philanthropist, advisor, and advocate. Please welcome Michelle Ruiz. Welcome to the show.
Great to join you here.
And what an appropriate day for us to come together. Today, as we're filming, is International Women's Day, and I cannot think of a more appropriate, incredible, aligned guest to have.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, you have amassed quite a collection of accolades, but it hasn't always been that way. So talk to us a little bit about your journey.
Yes. So, I live today a very purpose-driven life. And so much of what I am involved in, what I, focus on accomplishing and achieving, for others, it's really around my desire to really live intentionally and with purpose. So, my journey, my goodness, when that story comes out, there'll be stories, first of all, around how, when I grew up, I had very challenging circumstances when I grew up. I was raised by a single parent who, didn't have a college education herself. Unfortunately, we had a very unstable financially situation, being evicted without food, lights being turned off, all this kind of stuff. And so and there was some other, traumatic experiences. And so I, grew into my early adulthood becoming very self-reliant. I had to be. I really had no choice. And I know, Ellie, your story, you understand the lessons and the value of becoming self-reliant. And so that really kind of led me, or I should say, propelled me into my early profession, which, as you mentioned, was in television news. I was a news anchor and reporter here in Los Angeles for the Tribune Company, KTLA, and then after that for NBC. And then when I decided to leave and start a business, it was because I was focused on starting a business that had impact for Latinos in the United States. That was my first company. It was a media company in the how-to aspirational space. And I had kind of gotten to that point, in my television professional career, where I was really questioning what I really wanted to do moving forward. And part of what prompted me to do that self-reflection is because sadly, I lost a son. And that really reoriented my perspective on what was important in life and what was not important in life. And that really changed so much about how I think about things and what I value and what I feel isn't so important any longer. And so when I decided to leave broadcasting and start my first company, which was, as I mentioned, a media company for Latinos in the how-to aspirational space, that was my first. I knew nothing about running a business or entrepreneurship, but I raised $1 million in seed capital over a lunch without a business plan or anything, just talking through the story of this vision that I saw. And so I say to people, I became an entrepreneur because I raised money too easily, but it works. So here, fast forward, now, as you mentioned, I have several companies, and currently it is my science-based HR technology company focused on measuring, assessing, and ultimately disrupting the impact of unconscious bias in organizations. And, here in 2022, there's a lot of interest and focus on that, not just race and gender, but focus on that as it pertains to members of the LGBTQIA plus community and others. And then I have my consulting company. And so here I am now at this stage in my life where I'm really about impact, and all the good things that I want and have wanted have materialized and will continue to materialize. But I worry less about that and focus more on being very intentional about how I lead my life and spend my time and who I spend it with.
Amazing. So in your journey, how did leaning into this passion for impact, particularly impact focusing on the unconscious biases that exist, what was the genesis of that?
Well, it's interesting. Forming my company BiasSync I was challenged to come up with a solution to be a disruptor in the marketplace. So what happened was one of my co-founders, who's been a business mentor of mine for many years, called me up one day and said, I've been looking to, purchase some kind of diversity and inclusion training, and everything I see online is just terrible. He said, some stuff about this. Go out and let's figure out a disruptor to this space and bring something better to the marketplace. Now, if you knew my co-founder, who's a very successful tech entrepreneur, I think BiasSync is probably his 13th or 14th company that he initially seeded and got up off the ground. He knows a fair amount about disrupting markets. So long story short, drawing on my journalism background, I really started to research what the solutions were out in the marketplace and why objectives still weren't being met as it pertains to more diversity, inclusion, and equity, even though the concept has been around since the civil rights era, and it's just continued to evolve since then. Started obviously with racial equity and then evolved to gender equity. So when he kind of challenged me to go out and figure it out and come back, that's what I did. And then I realized that the reason why many companies are not achieving these objectives is because the root cause is unconscious bias, and companies either not knowing that and therefore not focused on it, or not having the right kinds of solutions to address it. So that really started the journey for me to focus on addressing and disrupting the impact of unconscious bias. And I say that, when we talk about helping to mitigate the impact in workplaces, we're really talking about negative impact for typically, underrepresented groups, minorities, women. By the way, people who are disabled, people who are members of the LGBTQIA plus community and other what we would call categories. And in particular, as it pertains to women, I often talk about, when we can disrupt the impact of unconscious bias, we're changing people's equity outcomes in the workplace. And when we change their equity outcomes in the workplace, we're changing their family equity outcomes. And when we change that financial piece on the family side, then we're impacting the generations that come after. So it's really significant work. It's not just about mitigating the impact of unconscious bias. It's much bigger, broader than that. And so to your question, Ellie, about leaning in, I couldn't be more pleased and happier and proud that we're focused on this because of the bigger, broader impact. And of course, now we live in this world in 2022 where the world is focused on, the diversity, equity, inclusion, and equity in particular.
Absolutely. I mean, your work couldn't be more timely. It couldn't be more significant. And to your point, the ripple effect, right? The
Yes.
ripple effect, not only in this generation with the families and the communities, but to your point, intergenerationally, and really impacting that family wealth, the family perspectives, the family lifestyles that get passed down from generation to generation. So really, really important work. What biases?
Yeah, I'm just going to add, remember that question. Yeah. I'm just going to add that, I had clearly have experienced bias throughout certainly in broadcasting. I can only hope it's better, but, it was not, I'll just give some very simple examples. When I was in television news, it was not uncommon for women news anchors to be paid less than male news anchors. And the system perpetuated that. And contractually, you couldn't even talk about wages. And that's a way to keep, inequities in pay. But by the way, it's not just the pay piece. The research shows that people watch television news and will make a decision about watching or not watching based on the female anchor, not so much the male anchor. So what I mean by that is, so the women news anchors play a very important role in terms of viewers watching, but yet from an equity perspective, the male anchors are paid significantly more. I knew that, but it was kind of the state of the business, and there wasn't really much that you could say. I'm assuming that there's been a lot of progress in that regard. But, the other piece to that is I've also experienced racial bias, and I've also, I've experienced that in business. I've experienced it in different cases, but now I'm much more aware and alert to it, obviously, because of having started Biasync. And, for the most part, figured out how to recognize it when it's happening, and two, how to address it.
So let's talk about some practical tips, because you're not alone. You're not alone. People who are experiencing gender bias or, bias based on their religion or their sexual orientation or their cultural background or their nationality. So let's talk about some ways that people can recognize, some ways that people can navigate, and also some ways that people can really find their voice and step into asking for what they need or reporting or that type of thing.
Yeah. So, I'm going to focus my comments mostly on interacting in daily life externally, not, internally with family members or friends, but just externally based in our jobs and, businesses. And the research is ample about both racial bias and gender bias as it pertains to, for example, women are generally speaking not given as many opportunities as men. Now, there are myriad of reasons for that. And some of them are well-intentioned, but unfortunately missing the mark. I'll give you an example. It is not uncommon to have both a male and a female employee who are being considered for a major client-facing project, right? Let's just say it's a large consulting company or whatever the case is. And the leader, the manager, or the executive making the decision about which of the two individuals to assign as the lead on this big major client, project, that person could be taken into account. Oh, she has children, she has a family, her kids are younger, they probably need her. Joe can just hop on a plane and go anytime. They think they're doing her a favor. So they send Joe and they assign him this, big client-facing project. So here's what happens. Down the road, when it comes time to evaluate her, let's just call her Mary, for her performance review, compensation, etc. On paper, she looks worse than he does, but it's because she wasn't given the opportunities. And, that happens a lot. And unconscious biases are really about stereotyping. And again, when we talk about unconscious biases, this is not intentional behavior. This is our brain making snap decisions, snap judgments, often based on stereotyping and not almost always not fully cognizant of the impact on either a particular individual or groups of individuals. So, that's an example of where women should feel like they can either be very directive in their requests, as in there may be in the performance review, or they've just been hired and they'd like to say, hey, I really want to just make sure that, we are really focused on inclusivity and equity. And I want to make sure that as, these key opportunities or projects come up, that I'm evaluated, and considered for them. In other words, we put the request out there. We let the people who are making the decision know that we really want them. That would be, as an example, a suggestion. There are, what's known as microaggressions, microinvalidations, micro insults that happen. Microaggressions are things such as, what would you know about that? You're Latina, and, in other words, like making assumptions, and, that would be a microaggression. These are these tiny little things that sting people. They're not these overt, obnoxious behaviors. Again, that's explicit behavior. They're these small little stings, but they add up. Microinvalidation would be something like we're in a meeting and, let's just say there were, 8 people in the room. I was the only woman or one of the few women. And, the guys were speaking over me, which, by the way, happens a lot in terms of what we view about how people treat women and men in the workplace. Women are constantly spoken over by men. And so let's just say that happened. I was quiet during the meeting, but after the meeting, I went to my manager or supervisor and I said, hey, I just wanted to bring to your attention that I felt that during the meeting, every time I wanted to contribute, I was spoken over. And since you were leading the meeting, I wanted to bring it to your attention so that maybe we can figure out a way for that not to happen. And then microvalidation is, oh, Michelle, you're just taking it too seriously. Mm-hmm. Or, oh, no one meant anything by that. In other words, invalidating my experience, right? We can bring these kinds of situations, up. There's so many, Ellie. I could write a book. we can write a book because I know you're into just about navigating life and all the different biases that come up. There's recency bias. There's all kinds of things that, that can come up. But it's really about speaking up when we feel like we've experienced something that just doesn't feel right. By the way, more often than not, people don't mean it. It's either a lack of awareness. And so not often that it happens to me often, but when I do notice it, I will assume that they didn't realize it. And so I will just say, oh, you probably didn't realize this, but this is how I experienced that meeting or that conversation or this situation, or, when you said that. Like that. So maybe I just wanted you to know how it landed. So you kind of, you're not like, you did this or you did that, or, you're kind of just opening up the possibility that they didn't realize or didn't understand, but at the same time expressing, your observation and making a request when appropriate. So,
yeah, I think that's really powerful because so many times if you're in a situation where repeatedly you aren't seen or repeatedly you aren't heard or you are repeatedly invalidated, to your point earlier, or you're repeatedly spoken over, or when you go to say something, you're dismissed. So for so many people who are experiencing this again and again and again, oftentimes they feel like, well, what's the point in speaking up? What's the point in bringing it to their attention? Because yet again, I'm going to be dismissed or unseen or unheard or invalidated. And so I think that's a really important point that you just brought up. And I think that's really powerful languaging that we are equipping the audience to be able to use. I think to your point of really assuming that they didn't realize and assuming that it is an unconscious bias. And so to be able to frame it that way is not threatening.
Right. Now, I say that with a caveat in that, again, the science and the research shows this. Women typically, we're relationship people, right? We value relationships statistically more so than men. Not that men don't value relationships, but we're very relationship driven. We ponder and think and stew over a dynamic that happened in a conversation or an engagement, where men can kind of like, and then off they go. It doesn't even like register, right? So consequently, when we're engaging with individuals, we can often want to be too soft, too polite, because we are concerned about how we might be perceived. And there is legitimate basis for that, by the way. So I say to you, yes, I do recommend that you assume the positive, that they didn't mean it, or unless it was so overt or the behavior is so obnoxious. But there are times when a very, very direct, straightforward communication is important. And sometimes we, as women, we can become too concerned about people's perception of us, and then we are less direct, but we don't get to a resolution, right? So there are times when it does make sense to be more direct and very specific about what occurred and what you'd like to see or what you'd like to not see happen, in the future. So I just say that because that also sometimes comes into play.
Absolutely. So in those moments where it's important to be direct, those would be the instances where it's, well, in the meeting, I felt unseen, or, I don't appreciate being spoken over. We've discussed it previously, and, I don't feel like we're having a resolution. The situation isn't changing. The behavior is continuing to happen. Are those the kind of examples that you're referencing?
Yeah, especially if you brought it up before, you would say, and my request is that next Tuesday at our weekly meeting, I ask that you be paying attention and aware. And if you see myself or another woman being interrupted, that you actually step in and say, oh, so-and-so, let's stop. Let's let her finish what she has to say. I'm really interested. I really want to hear what she has to say. Let's just stop. Let's not interrupt her. Yeah. So there are times where you need to be very specific and direct about your request. And so, yes, that would definitely be, a situation like that.
Yeah. And I think that's a muscle that as women takes some development for us. I mean, so often we don't ask for help. So often we don't speak up for really our needs, our wants, our expectations. And so I love that this is something that we can actually practice. It is a muscle that we can develop in all areas of our life as we as women really find our voice, stand in our power, and feel empowered to speak, to ask for what we want, to be clear in our communication, and to set boundaries.
For sure. And even on the personal side, direct communication. I felt this, or I feel this, and I need this goes a long way.
Absolutely. I mean, no one's a mind reader. Yeah. No one's a mind reader, right? So being clear with what we need and want. Now, you are a mentor to so many. We spoke earlier about really leaning into this life of purpose and this life of impact. And you have really stepped into this transformational leadership space, this thought leadership space, and are there for so many women. What's the true genesis of that? Did you have mentors that you looked up to, or are you the mentor now that you wish you had?
Oh, good question. Actually, both. I certainly had individuals looking out for me outside of my immediate family in my childhood and young adulthood. A teacher stands out in particular who, really paid a lot of attention to me in high school, a high school counselor, et cetera. But to your point, I didn't really have the knowledge, wherewithal, or the confidence, candidly, to ask for support and help. I remember in my early 20s, I put myself through college. I worked and paid my way through. And it was not easy. It was not easy. So I was shouldering a lot. And I didn't really know where to go for help. I didn't know how to ask for help and those kinds of things. And then because of my very unstable childhood, I certainly had a lot of confidence issues and things like that. And then as I became wiser and life experiences, and, I got married and had children. And as I mentioned, I lost a child. And then I became clearer about asking for help. And then as I then became an entrepreneur, then I realized, I'm going to need business mentors to scale and grow. And so I did identify a couple of women business owners who have had at the time and continue to have very thriving, robust businesses. But I also have men mentors as well. And I think that's important because one, it is important to have women, it's important to have women mentors because, especially as business owners, because there are challenges that we face that you can't really talk with a lot of people. And so you want to have people that you can talk through issues that are coming up or challenges that you're having or concerns that you may be, whether it's an HR issue, an employee issue, or, who knows, whatever the case. These aren't things that you can be talking to your employees about or scaling or or revenues going down, things like that. But also important to have male entrepreneurs. In other words, diversity amongst your mentors. I meant to say male mentors, not male entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
And diversity in your mentors is good because there's also, learnings that you can learn from them. So while I think group constructs are important, it also is very important to get out of our various group constructs. So the second part of your question is that the mentor I wish I had. Yeah, I think so too. I've had so many experiences in my life that have really impacted me, and I have a lot to share. Which is really the genesis of my program, Possibility Architect. And by the way, I didn't come up with that name. I was meeting with a dear friend of mine who is also a mentor. And he said to me one day, we were talking, he said, Michelle, you know what you are? You're the possibility architect. And I looked at him, his name is Mark, and I looked at him kind of puzzled. And he said, you've architected all your opportunities in your life. You're the one who architected them. I'm like, oh, I kind of thought about it, and he was right. He's a psychiatrist by training, and so I'm sure there was some awareness piece there too. And so that's really kind of what prompted me to zero in on how can I help and mentor women. Well, I get asked also by men too, but in particular in the entrepreneurship space. But I have several businesses, and one of them is investor backed, and so I need to figure out scale. Like, how can I mentor and scale? Right? How can I mentor as many people as possible, but I can't do it necessarily one-on-one. My investors expect that I'm focused on the growth of the company and hitting all those milestones and things like that. So that's really the genesis of my Possibility Architect program. And there will be a book coming under that title too.
I can't wait to read it. So with all the different mentors you've had, what's the best advice you have received?
Okay, so I'll tell you on the business side, as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, the best advice I've received is hire slow, fire fast.
Wow.
Because on the business side, a bad hire can cost the company a lot. So when you see signs that someone's a bad hire, you just fire fast. And sometimes it gets so committed to a path, and therefore a path of the person, because we've invested so much, right? We recruited them, we've interviewed them, we hired them, we've trained them, and all this kind of stuff. And 3-4 months, maybe even sooner, 2 months into it, we're kind of seeing, this really isn't panning out the way we want it. We think about everything we went through. Can we continue to work with the person? All that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, or maybe it's a performance issue or a culture issue with that person. It ends up costing you as an employer, you as a CEO or a president of your company, a lot. So that's the greatest business advice I've received. On the personal side, the greatest advice I have received is, and this ties to resiliency, is sometimes when you're going through things, again, I'll use the example of losing my son. The science, the research shows that that's the greatest loss any person can experience, more so than loss of a parent or the loss of a partner or a spouse, because it's the loss of a future. No one expects to outlive your children. And I learned through the most traumatic experiences that there's always something there that can help you become more resilient, or there's something there that can make you a better individual. And so if you can look at it that way, not to dismiss or discount the traumatic experience or the terrible, situation, but there's often some good for you personally as a person, how you evolve, how you develop, how you see the world, that can actually contribute to your growth as a person. So I would say that looking at how these, difficult circumstances have made me more resilient, have more capacity, more empathy, those kinds of things. And staying focused on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Tony Robbins likes to frame that as training yourself to know and recognize that life happens for you.
Yeah, and right.
My friend Maya Camarota, she builds on that, and I love her take. She says, life happens for you, through you.
Yeah.
And it is through these experiences that we have, the events and circumstances of our life, that when we can learn to find the good, to find the lesson.
Yes.
To focus on that, to focus on the growth and the opportunity. And, Lisa Nichols likes to say, sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in sandpaper.
That's a good, I'll have to remember that. I'll have to remember that. I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
I often say I would wish the experience of losing a child on anyone. Yeah. However, having had that experience, I am such a more conscious, better individual as a person. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, to your point earlier, that was such a pivotal moment that allowed you to take stock, to take inventory, and to reprioritize your life. So in that moment, your entire life shifted, and it set you on this path, the path of impact, the path of purpose, the path of really being present, of reprioritizing what's truly important to you. And now you've had all of these true moments where you're present and you're experiencing each and everything to the fullest.
I certainly try.
Yeah.
Much better at it today, yes, than I've ever been.
Yeah. So we've touched on some lessons that you've learned along the way, and we've touched on these amazing things that your mentors have shared. But what's something that you wish someone had told you that you had to learn the hard way?
That I had to learn the hard way. The first thing that comes to mind is looking at situations that come up on a daily basis and using the criteria to evaluate the significance of this. In other words, while in the moment in time, it may be aggravating, upsetting, whatever the situation is, but will this matter, 5 weeks from now or 5 months from now or 5 years from now. Mm. And when I learned that later in life, I thought back, wow, if I had had that, pearl of wisdom much earlier in my life, I could have saved myself a lot of grief.
Absolutely.
A lot of grief, internal, upsetness, questioning, all kinds of anger, hurt, who knows? Because by putting it in that perspective and knowing that it's just a temporary situation, but in life, it won't really, you're not going to look back and go, oh, like that's going to be a pivotal moment as you look back on the time period. That really just frames how you can move through your days and your life and kind of try and put things in perspective.
So important. I think now, especially after the last 2 years, after so many of the twists and turns that we've experienced of what's currently going on in the world, I think that's a really powerful pearl of wisdom that you are sharing with the audience. To stop. Is this going to matter? Is this going to matter in a month? Is this going to matter in a year? Is this going to matter in 5 years? To reframe, to keep things in perspective. There are real issues going on in the world right now. And so to be able to stop, and even when it feels like the walls are caving in, even when it feels like things are really chaotic, thank you for sharing that. Stop, ask yourself these questions, keep it in perspective. Really, really powerful. So thank you for sharing that.
Yes, for sure. And you're right. The world is so upside down right now that it makes even more sense to be able to be mindful in that regard.
So what trends are you seeing in the space? I mean, there was unconscious bias, for forever. And here we are with the Me Too movement, and then George Floyd, and then COVID. And with COVID, people having to work from home, and now compounding being everything to everyone. And now they're working from home and their spouse is working from home and they're not getting that FaceTime in front of their boss, and the kids are running around in the back and all the things. So given all of that, what trends are you seeing in the space?
Well, so interesting that we're having this conversation at this moment in time, because as a tech entrepreneur, I'm getting ready to raise another round of capital. And so I'm literally been immersed in the last few days in our story and trends and, those kinds of things. So it's so front of center in my mind right now. Well, what I can tell you is that the world is focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I would say today, in 2022. And I would say that there's also more focus on the inclusion and equity piece, not just diversity, right? So we evolved from diversity, and diversity is about numbers. Are there diversity in the numbers? Do we, X percentage of our employees are A, and then B and C and D and E and F, whatever. But the real challenge becomes you can have diversity but not have inclusion. You can have by the numbers a diverse workforce, but employees do not feel included, or certain groups of employees don't feel included, or that it's an inclusive environment. Equity is a different piece. Obviously, when we think equity, we're always thinking compensation equity, but there's other kinds of equity in opportunities, and other stages. And what the research has shown today, I'll give you a couple of pieces of information. This great resignation that we're hearing about, right? Employees leaving the workforce in greater numbers than they've ever left. Not just, certainly during the pandemic, but even still, many of them have left because of their perception that they've worked in a toxic environment. And the pandemic really brought that up more so than before. And often the toxicity is directly correlated with lack of inclusiveness and lack of focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what we're seeing in trends is that employers are much more focused on it, not because it's a good thing to do. There's some real financial economic impact to employers who are not focused on it. When you're not focused on DE&I, and now, by the way, the federal government's using A's, so diversity, equity, inclusion, and A for accessibility, or ability. Some might say the A is ability, but in the federal government, they use it as accessibility. It impacts productivity. It impacts retention. It certainly impacts recruitment. It creates reputational issues. And this research has been around for a long time that more diverse, inclusive environments lead to greater innovation. So it has a very direct correlation to profitability, bottom line, and innovation. So this is no longer a nice to have or a good thing to do. The other thing is you have states that are now mandating looking at this. And by the way, we're pleased to see as the world is focused on more diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's also more focus on the role unconscious bias plays. Unfortunately, that is something that we've been focused on even before the pandemic and George Floyd, in and around the time of the Me Too movement. And so unconscious bias is at the root of why a lot of these challenges are occurring. And now you have states and the federal government mandating unconscious bias training, because the headline is unconscious bias kills. So what do I mean? If you look at the outcomes for people of color in the legal and judicial system, that's not a stretch. If you look at the outcomes for women and people of color in healthcare, it's not a stretch to say unconscious bias kills. The research is there about the inequity and the poorer outcomes for women in certain circumstances and people of color. By the way, there is a known bias called socioeconomic bias too. It's not just race, gender. I mean, there's many biases. There are many biases that come into play. So the overarching trend is that the world is focused on this. We're seeing compliance we're seeing it as part of compliance more and more. We're seeing, you look at the diversity roles and the uptick in hires at companies, it's like grown by 300% just in the last 18 months. So that's obviously a direct result of the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Movement, and the growing awareness about the inequity for people of color. And, in those instances, we think Black people, because obviously George Floyd was Black and Black Lives Matter is focused on Black individuals, but we cannot forget that these movements that can be attributed to African Americans or Blacks, as an example, can positively impact other minority groups, Hispanics and others. So that in and of itself is a good thing. With respect to the gender inequities, certainly the Me Too movement brought a lot of attention to that. And I know boards of directors are more and more growing. More and more boards of directors are focusing on that as a risk factor when they look at company performance and want to make sure that they don't have legal risks as it pertains to gender inequity. And it's not just paying compensation.
Absolutely. So beyond the requirements now for diversity and inclusivity training, for sensitivity training, what are some other effective strategies that you're seeing to really change the dialogue and to actually move the needle?
Well, I would put forth BioSync, and our behavior change approach is moving the needle. When we looked at the marketplace, remember, I go back to how we kind of started the conversation about really looking at the marketplace and creating a market disruptor. One of the things that we identified was that the old way of doing things just wasn't moving the needle, and that we really needed a behavior change approach. And so we're rooted in science and research and what we know about behavior changes and how to influence behavior changes. And it's a combination of things. It's not just education as in trainings and things like that. The research shows that trainings alone do not move the needle. There is a place for trainings, and I'm not saying that trainings aren't valuable, but to rely simply on trainings is not enough to move the needle. So I would say we have that way. Science-based and evidence-based approach and focused on behavior change, which is not just a one-off situation. There's a series of things that needs to occur, both on the individual level for employees, but also on the broader level as companies look at their policies, practices, and procedures.
Well, amazing. And, as we've talked a lot about really how you pour into the world, how you serve, how you live this life of purpose and impact with BiasSync, with your consulting firm, with Possibility Architect, with all of the incredible people that you mentor and all of the lives that you change. What do you do to fill your cup so that you can go forth and serve at the level that you do?
My secret weapon is sleep. That first and foremost. I used to be one of those individuals because I would, and still is, my life is very high throttle. I operate in two states, full throttle or catatonic. And catatonic because I've been at full throttle too long, and then boom, I hit the wall and I got to take 2 or 2.5 days to kind of just re-energize. But sleep in the bigger context of self-care. And I know, I used to be able to operate on 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night pretty consistently, not the case anymore. Doesn't mean that I can't wake up if I've only had 4 or 5 hours. But what it means is I'm much more aware of how it impacts me, my cognitive abilities, my mood, my interactions with people. And so I really focus on sleep, and that just allows me to show up more intentionally and the way I want to show up in the world and be focused on all those things. And then the other piece is really, I continue down this mindfulness journey, and I do a lot of study and mindfulness and more work along those lines. So that's kind of what fills my cup.
I love that. Mindfulness and sleep.
100%. Yes.
Absolutely. So let's imagine, as we start to wind down, that it is the end of your life best lived. You're coming towards the end of your journey here on this earth, and you have left it all on the table. You have served at the highest level. You have been fully present. You have done all the things you came here to do. What do you want them to say about you when you're gone?
So there is a quote that I landed on some years ago, which I think sums up my perspective on that. And that is, when you were born, you were crying and people around you were smiling. Live your life so that when you die, you're smiling and people around you are crying. That's it.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Amazing. And so it is.
And so it is. Exactly.
And so it is. So how can people connect with you? How can they find out more about BiasSync? How can they find out more about Possibility Architect and the other programs and services that you offer?
Oh, thank you. So I'm very findable online, Michelle Ruiz with 1 L. And so I have my website. I'm on, all the major social profiles. My company, BiasSync, BIAS, bias, and then sync, because we all need to be in sync around mitigating the impact of unconscious bias. My consulting company, Ruiz Strategies, and I think Possibility Architect is, by the way, we're launching the full program over these next couple of months. So at the moment, you can find some high level information on my personal website under my name, but soon we'll have a Possibility Architect website as well. So
amazing. So if somebody wants to be part of Possibility Architect, they still have time to reach out, go to your website, learn more about it.
Yeah, and they're all of those are ways they're ways, prompts to how to communicate with me and send me a message. And so
amazing.
Yeah, I think I have 8 sources of ways people are, between LinkedIn and Twitter and, all these other ways. There are myriad of ways that people can reach out to me. So
for everyone in the audience, do reach out. As you can see, Michelle is exceptional. So reach out to her, learn more about Possibility Architect, learn more about navigating unconscious bias. It's so important, and it's something that we can all do our part to mitigate. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the work that you do in the world. Thank you for the way that you show up. Thank you for the lives that you change, not only for today, but for tomorrow. Thank you for your commitment to such such critical work and for how you pour your heart and soul into living every single day as a force for good.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Are Not Your Scars. Be sure to implement the tools and strategies shared today as you create a limitless life. Know that you are worthy, you are resilient, you are unbreakable, and you are unstoppable. Find more episodes of this podcast at youarenotyourScarsPodcast.com. While you may have been forged by fire, you are free by design.